This is Changeling the podcast.
Welcome to Changeling the podcast, your 24/7 one-stop shop for night terrors, daydreams, and anything in between. I'm your host, Puka, and I am joined by Fetch. Hello, Fetch.
Hello, Puka, and hello, audience. I cannot help but notice I spot an unusually high number of pointed fangs in the crowd tonight.
Dum dum dum. The first rule of Pointed Fangs is we don't talk about the Pointed Fangs.
Yes, because the masquerade is important, and in tonight's episode, we will be discussing crossovers between Changing the Lost and Vampire the Requiem.
Yeah, the Masquerade's important, but not important enough to keep in the title of the game for some reason.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Audience members are probably familiar with Vampire the Masquerade. I mean, they must be, right? Like, much as I love Dreaming and Lost, if you think of one game associated with the World of Darkness, it's Vampire the Masquerade.
Well, and beyond that, like, just the concept of vampires, I would say, in the past 30 years in media has been so shaped by Vampire the Masquerade that even if you haven't played it or read it, you probably know some of the concepts associated with it.
Today, however, we're not talking about Masquerade. We will be talking about its new World of Darkness equivalent, Vampire the Requiem, which is to Masquerade what Lost is to Dreaming.
And we're doing this after having gone through the God of Machine rules update, because in the first batch of Dark Eras that we're going to be getting into that deal with these crossovers, Vampire's setting and approach to the character building and everything, those will have been updated along with those rules, while Changelings has not yet been. So it's a little confusing, but I don't think it'll matter too much that our discussion today is more aligned with second edition Requiem, because we're talking in fairly broad strokes. So we'll give you the facts if you need to splash crossover into your Lost game, as the Dark Era module will encourage.
If you've never heard of Requiem, this will give you some idea of the basics of it, along with its notable differences from Masquerade. But this will not be a deep dive into the Requiem book.
This ain't Requiem, the podcast. And a good thing, too. I don't think I would do that one. Anyway,
the podcast, we'd have to be embraced, right? Like the podcast host would have to get embraced, and then naturally it has to turn into a vampire podcast.
You know, table that title, Podcast the Embraced, because that should be something in the future. Someone was asking on the Discord the other day, what's a good vampire podcast? And like, you know, the usual suggestions rolled out. But I think what they were looking for precisely does not exactly exist. So let's talk a bit about the history here. Vampire the Requiem was the first game released for the new World of Darkness, coming out in August 2004 as part of the relaunch. I would say the reaction among my own circles was tepid, with a hefty dose of, are you freaking kidding me? Because the lead up to this, with Time of Judgment, they had really sold it as this is going to be an entirely different universe and experience and everything. And what we got was a new vampire game that was really quite similar to the old one, with the added headache of some but not all of the many recycled terms having slightly different meanings. I can't remember, did you play Requiem before Masquerade?
I technically started with some IRC server happened to use Law by Night's rules for it was a silly idea.
Interesting.
But no, I actually kind of only even learned about the World of Darkness around the time they were doing the transition.
Okay.
And so I had none of the background that you had going into it. Although I do remember initially feeling quite similar because all I had known by that point was Masquerade.
Okay. I was just curious if the reverse experience would feel the same, because I would say of all of the old and new World of Darkness pairings, the Masquerade and Requiem are the two that are probably most similar to each other.
You know, I wonder actually how intentional that is. Like, obviously, it is at least somewhat intended.
Yeah.
They borrow some of the familiar names, as you said.
However,
Which we will get into. However, it is a common complaint that it was too similar, and when they came back around for a second edition of the game, the book we'll be talking about primarily today, they made significant revisions to it.
Mm-hmm.
You could still get the two confused at first glance, but over time, Requiem did eventually evolve its own identity.
Yeah. And on the way there, it did get like dozens of books released monthly or bi-monthly right up through the dissolution of the original White Wolf Publishing. And so then, as we talked about last time, when Onyx Path took up the reins, they released the Strix Chronicle in December 2013. And then they were like, yeah, it's second edition. So they renamed it in 2014 and re-released it. And I think I'm right in saying all of the second edition New World of Darkness games ended up being kind of a limited run by design, right? Because this one only got 5 supplements in second edition, which is still more than any of the others apart from Demon. But still.
Yeah.
The glory days of 40 books is no more.
Yeah, no, I'm guessing that had something to do with, one, Vampire's an evergreen popular game, which is why it had more than the others, and then 2, at some point, Paradox stopped approving pitches. I think that if that hadn't happened, we would have seen a lot more supplements overall, but especially for Vampire.
Yeah, probably. So I want to hold forth for a minute about the themes of this game, and I'm really looking to the second edition core book here, where the themes laid out at the start are Requiem and Masquerade, Old and New, and Piety and Blasphemy. The first one is the contrast between that inner turmoil around being a vampire versus passing as a mortal. The second is about being ancient while also continuing to evolve in the present. And the third is about being good or bad or in between. These are all pretty individual, and on top of that, politicking isn't listed as an overt theme, but the game does kind of push in that direction structurally. All of which echoes Vampire the Masquerade pretty directly. But reading through this, I kind of got the feeling in the original conception, in the original Masquerade, there was this tension between the individual and society that was reflected by their idea of the Gothic punk. And ironically, that's something which V5 has pushed back towards the front by making the main political tension between Camarilla and Anarch, rather than with Sabbat, which Masquerade originally grew into, and the politicking around that, which it got bogged down in. Requiem was intended to be this fresh start, not bogged down by the years of entrenched like metaplot. But I say this without having played it. My sense is that unaligned Kindred, which are the equivalent of Anarchs here, don't really get much attention. And so the game's primary themes are built more around personal moral choices within the system rather than how the player chooses to respond to the authority. Part of what makes me think that is the game rewards you for being in a covenant, because you get these fancy powers for being part of this political unit that we'll talk about in a minute. So I was, to turn this into a question, I'm curious whether you've had players who want to play unaligned or want to make the game more about not necessarily tearing down the system they're stuck in, but wrangling with it in a more social way. Because I'm kind of grasping at straws a little, but I do see this as a difference with Masquerade, and I'm wondering how different it really is in the way it's played.
Okay.
Sorry, it's a big piece.
First, context. I have never run a Requiem campaign.
Okay.
I have played in a Requiem 1E game. I have read plenty of Requiem books, and I have used vampires from both first and second edition material in my other games. That said, I'm happy to give you my perspective on this idea of the unaligned.
Yeah.
I have always seen folks want to align themselves with one group or another, whether we're talking about Masquerade or Requiem. Yes, the Anarchs are the ones who refuse to participate in the Camarilla, and they're also not part of the Sabbat, but they typically take on political overtones anyway, because what do you think is going to happen when you have 20 vampires who say they're unaligned but all hang out together? In Masquerade, I'm going to pitch and say it is totally okay to play an unaligned character, and you may want to do that in a mixed game. Again, not Requiem the podcast, so I'll keep this brief. I have played in a game where one player was a member of each covenant, and yes, you can certainly do that. However, I feel that dilutes the themes of each of the covenants. Do it if you like, but be aware that you're not going to be able to give as much focus to any one of them. I had prepped for a game where one of the covenants I think was nominally going to feature as a major one, but didn't happen. I haven't played one where it's unaligned. But that said, in Requiem, it would be perfectly acceptable to play a lay member of any one of the covenants. You take no dots in status. You have no responsibilities, but you are claimed by that covenant. You could theoretically also say that you are completely unaligned, in which case the power structure would just kind of go, all right, I guess you don't show up to church on Sunday. We're still your government, so I guess just, don't deoberize anybody, please.
Well, that's the thing, is that when I think of Masquerade and people actually, in my experience at least, it's often characters who pay lip service to the idea of these larger sects without truly leaning into it. And Requiem, given how much more intricate the covenants feel, I suppose, I can imagine people getting more into that aspect of it. And maybe you do want to actually, no one I've seen play Masquerade, very few people have actually taken dots in status. It's there, it's a background, but who cares? Whereas here, there is actually something tangible around that. But yeah, it was just something that stood out to me.
I think the irony is that it is reversed, that Requiem does have a very deep structure for you to dive into, especially with the bennies that they added for 2nd edition. But a character could, in a lot of cities, just be unaligned or a lay person and nobody cares. Whereas in a game of Masquerade, if you just said, yeah, I'm not with anybody at all, that's going to get you in trouble.
Yeah. Well, in principle. In actuality, I don't think anyone ever really had an issue with it. But the other piece here, I would talk about moods, but they don't actually really give much in the way of mood. They just point people towards inspirational media, which I think is a little bit of a cop-out, but at least Near Dark is on the list. But themes and moods always bring me back to the question, especially compared with Masquerade, why is this take on vampires unique and interesting? And there might not be a good answer.
I have some answers on it.
Well, so okay, what do you think this take is unique and interesting?
Okay, let's start with the big picture. Requiem is, like Changing the Lost and every other New World of Darkness game, a toolbox approach. In Requiem, vampires are not weighed down by the thousands of pages of lore that are part of Masquerade. While individual vampires might have their own elaborate histories, there's not a lot that you need to know. And even in the books that delve into things such as covenant structure, it's all optional. Because that ties into, say, it's the toolbox approach. So a toolbox approach to using vampires so you can remix your favorite elements from Masquerade or make something wholly your own. Then there's the differences in what we get. Now, I'm going to tell you some of these are unique. How interesting they are is going to depend on person to person. So I'll give you the broad strokes, and then I'll just highlight ones that I find worth talking about. First off, we drop from 13 plus clans to only 5. We have the Daeva, which kind of like Toreador.
The ones you die for.
Do you have the little things prepared?
I do,
Do you want to... Let's hear the little things for the clans.
So the Daeva are the ones you die for.
What about the Gangrel?
The ones you can't kill.
The Maquette?
The ones you don't see.
The Nosferatu?
The ones you fear.
And the Ventru?
The ones you can't deny.
Some of these names, Gangrel, Nosferatu, and Ventru, are very familiar.
Yeah. And Maquette's a deep cut, but is also from Masquerade.
The trick here is that though 3 of those have thematic resonance with the versions you know from Masquerade, but they have their own unique identities. Like Venture's more broadly embracing the concept of lordliness and the Nosferatu to disturb people, but it's no longer always a physical problem. A character's clan may be important to them, but is often secondary to their covenant. If you're wondering, well, cool, like what about all of my other cool concepts, like all the bloodlines? They have those too in this game.
But we don't actually get any bloodlines in 2nd edition core, right? I went flipping through, I didn't find any.
I thought they had 1 or 2 referenced in the back, but I don't recall whether they give any details.
Okay, they certainly referenced them here and there, but I was looking for like a splat write-up and didn't find any. But yeah.
I suppose they decided to not include them for one reason or another, but I think they include the rules for them.
Fine with me, because I do not like bloodlines.
For those who may be curious about the idea, in Masquerade, bloodlines were either offshoots of the clans or possibly wholly unique things. It was as much a social distinction as it was a supernatural one. In Requiem, a clan can develop a bloodline, which is a permutation of the blood. Typically, they get like a 4th discipline and an extra downside compared to the ordinary clan.
So many special disciplines.
They actually stopped doing that for 2nd edition. They have very few additional disciplines. It's usually just, hey, they get 4, and they have like a couple unique combo disciplines, devotions in this game.
Did any of the, I think, 80 from the 1st edition get brought into the 2nd?
I'm not sure they ever republish any of the ones from 1st edition.
Because that's the thing. People talk about Kith bloat and Changeling the Dreaming, but the bloodline and discipline bloat in Vampire the Requiem is like, that's equally a thing.
It's another thing I don't mind so much in the same way that I don't mind the extra content from Lost, because a bloodline is the easiest thing to
ignore,
include or ignore.
Yeah.
Within your clan, you also have the concept of blood sympathy now, which I don't think was a thing in Masquerade, where your character has innate ability to sense other members of their clan, including their sire, their child, and anyone else. It can even facilitate the use of disciplines on each other. Vampires still have humanity. However, when a vampire loses a dot of humanity, they can choose to accept a bane, which is one of the classic vampire weaknesses, like cannot cross running water, need permission in order to enter a person's house, and if they do so, then whatever triggered that loss of humanity will no longer cause them a problem.
So just to go through the mechanics of that, is it when you would roll a breaking point, because humanity is their breaking point system in this, you would instead take a bane, which would then, you'd have that like drawback, but you would never have to roll for that breaking point again?
I had to double check this because the wording seems odd.
Okay.
So you do need to suffer the breaking point, and my understanding is that you do lose the point of humanity, and then you take the bane, and whatever caused you to lose the humanity will not affect you again, but you do not regain the humanity.
Gotcha. And this is also, banes are the system that replace clan weaknesses as well. So the Daeva have their bane, Gangrel have theirs, etc.
Correct. There's the standard banes of all 5 of them. We mentioned covenants a little bit earlier, but time to go into that. In Masquerade, you have major covenants like Camarilla and Sabbat. The Camarilla is a footnote in vampiric history in Requiem. It was a major institution that claimed to represent all vampires back in the time of Rome, but it fell apart with the fall of Rome. Today, we have 5 groups called covenants. Do you have a little blurb for each one of these, or should I just run through them?
I just have an adjective.
Please, I'll go ahead and go down our covenants then. The Carthian movement.
The revolutionaries. Or I guess it's the revolution in the actual write-up, so I could just say that.
The Circle of the Crone.
The Mother's Army, sort of ritualistic ones.
The Invictus.
The elitist conspiracy of silence.
The Lenkia et Sanctum.
The sanctified religious types.
And the Ordo Dracul.
The defiant. But I think transcendent also works as a good description.
Yes. Some of these we'll talk about in better detail later, but at risk of oversimplifying the 5 of them, the Invictus are the inheritors of the supposed legacy of the Camarilla. If you think of what Camarilla is like in Masquerade, bunch of secretive elitists ruling the world from behind the scenes, and they're all literal vampires, you're thinking of the Invictus. Link at Sanctum think that God has chosen or cursed them to be monsters and torment humanity back onto the right path. They're often buddy-buddy with the Invictus, and they have, as one might imagine, very strong Catholic themes. A counterpoint to the Link at Sanctum is the Circle of the Crone, which tends to be more focused upon goddess cults, paganism, witchcraft. The idea generally being that they're looking to cultivate a sense of vampiric divinity within themselves, and often look to existing figures in myths to support that. Carthian movement are closest thing they have to anarchs in that they are the ones who want to change the system and be progressive. Unfortunately, they sometimes turn out to be very progressive for themselves and their friends and nobody else.
Go figure.
Yeah, who would be shocked with surprising vampires. And the Ordo Dracul are vampires who are like, we too want to achieve godhood, but through occult science. These are the jerks who will raid fairy circles looking for information, bust their way into the hedge, kill a changeling just to see what happens. And not just see what happens. They develop magical powers that will change their abilities and make them more resistant to the vagaries of vampiric existence. A lot of cool stuff. I could say a lot more about it. But again, we have only so much time, and there is so much we could say about them.
Just for the purposes of when we'll talk about the Dark Era, the Invictus and the Lankia et Sanctum are both kind of relevant to that story. In the second edition core book, they make reference to their historical alliance, and we kind of see that in the 4 when we get to Requiem for Regina. So much for separating church and state. Faith doesn't really have an impact, though, mechanically on vampires in Requiem, does it? Or is there like a true faith trait buried somewhere in here?
I think one of their banes is that if you deal with somebody who's got like a very high integrity, then you can't touch them.
Okay.
There's another one where you're like repelled by holy symbols, but like that's kind of a you thing, not like a...
Right. And the covenants, I know at least a few of them, you get some kind of blood magic out of it. Do they all?
Yes, all 5 of them get some kind of benefit. In brief, the Carthians can pass capital L laws, which work like sovereign in Changeling the Dreaming. They can just kind of alter reality in fun little ways. My favorite one is they can pass a law saying, you know what, this one vampire really sucks. And if enough Carthians show up, they can just drop this on that vampire's doorstep and say, hey, I've got a combined 15 dots worth of notation saying that you're a terrible person. You just lose 3 points of blood potency.
No. Blood potency? What's that?
I am glad you asked. I'm going to cover that after I talk about Mask and Dirge and Touchstones.
Okay.
Last note on covenants is that there is modularity on globularity. They do not have an overall global reach. They are global organizations, but no one covenant secretly rules the world. They all compete with each other and have varying presences in different cities. It is perfectly okay to have one game where the Circle of the Crone is in charge, and another game where the Invictus rules with the Lankia Sanctum at their right side, and a third city where they are all just minor actors against the great morass of vampires doing petty things to other vampires.
See, something I want to say at this point too, though, is because you pointed to with Masquerade having the thousands of pages of whatever, all of this Because the thing with Masquerade is it has that reputation. Putting aside the fact that Requiem also by this point had 40 odd books and thousands of pages of stuff, the Masquerade core book is perfectly sufficient as well for running a game. Like, all of it is optional there too. You can make allusions to the global conspiracies and the super powerful elders and little historical moments and stuff. And somebody who's into it will be into it. But it's never been, in my opinion, compulsory in either game. So I think it's a matter of different tastes. Like, if you're the kind of person who wants lots and lots of options, each of which, doesn't go super in depth, like, because you're talking about these as being localized. And you can also kind of present the factions and clans and Masquerade along the same lines if you so choose. It's kind of separate from the question of how the games as a whole have brought everything together, and more in the immediate sense of being a player at the table or a storyteller at the table. It's a matter of choice, I would say.
Yes,
I just have to get on my soapbox and defend Masquerade again. Because it's what everybody says. It's like, oh, Masquerade got so caught up in its own meta plot. It's like, well, yeah, if you let it, but
a good drill down for later on. I will just say that yes, you are correct on those.
Sorry, I kind of derailed us.
There's nuance, but maybe for later.
Yeah, tell us about the other stuff.
Yeah, so let's get into the actual more about the traits that they have. So Mask and Dirge replace nature and demeanor. Instead of who you appear to be to people on the outside and who you are deep down, we have who you present yourself to be around the mortals and who you must be around the vampires. Similar concepts, but a touch of nuance to it.
The Masquerade and the Requiem.
You now have at least one touchstone attached to your humanity. A touchstone is that last and most notable lingering attachment to your mortal existence. It could be a best friend. It could be a rival. It could be a cop who is hunting you down and you find fun with it. It could even be your own grave.
Ooh.
Now, you asked about blood potency.
Yeah.
Blood potency replaces generation. Generation was always an odd duck because in a game where vampires supposedly do not have a consistent story about where they come from, generation kind of says that there is one. They push back against that in like V5, but Requiem avoids the issue altogether by instead measuring how literally potent is your blood on a scale of 1 to 10. As blood potency rises, your character becomes more easily able to channel blood, eventually unlocking the ability to access higher levels of attributes and abilities, and some other benefits to it. Unlike generation, you can just increase your blood potency. Yes, Diablerie is still on the table, but blood potency increases on its own every 50 years. And you can spend experience points to augment it if your campaign is not taking place over the course of decades.
Huzzah.
I know, right? Now, it's not all good, because when your blood potency gets higher, you lose the ability to feed off of animals, and eventually to feed off of anything except for other vampires. It also affects just how badly the sun is going to mess with you. Probably shouldn't be getting in the sunlight anyway, but higher humanity, low blood potency vampires could, if they really had to, run from one building to another in the middle of the day. And they probably need to if they're that young and dealing with that kind of situation.
So, to that point, I was looking for stuff about the day sleep, and I don't know, does Requiem not kind of enforce sleeping during daytime as much? It seemed like you kind of had more options.
Yes, it is. It is still a thing which all vampires go through, but actually, just like Masquerade, you can try to operate during the day. In Masquerade, I think it's very specifically limited to...
it's tough.
Yeah, it's like a breach of your haven is the only thing which might let you get up.
Yeah, and you get like stamina plus fortitude turns to act, basically.
In Requiem, I think it's like you can stay up, you just hate it. Because remember, in a campaign I'm running right now, I have a young maquette vampire who's been bullied into doing all the grunt work for the structure. And that includes things like, hey, go out in the middle of the day and go check on this project for us. And he hates it. He hates the
I can
job.
imagine.
Yeah, he doesn't want to be up.
Well, so we're kind of getting into the more physical powers that vampires have. So let's talk about those.
Yeah. Folks are probably familiar with disciplines, the powers of the vampires. And the core ones are much the same, although often renamed. Nightmare is a mostly new discipline, taking dread gaze from presence, I think.
Presence too.
And spins that out into its whole 5-level discipline about just scaring the daylights out of people. No points for guessing the Nosferatu. Get that one. It replaces animalism for them.
We should mention that for anyone who hasn't played disciplines, by contrast with like contract, they are just 1 through 5, generally make a roll, sometimes spend a point of blood.
They also tend to be much more direct than what changing powers do. A changing power will give you a circumstantial bonus to all sorts of different things in combat, whereas a discipline will just go, I hurt you extra bad when I punch you.
You are scared now.
As part of this update with the disciplines, a lot of familiar disciplines like Auspex and Protean have had individual powers moved around compared to where people may be familiar with them in Masquerade. They may function significantly differently, and there may be some surprises in there. Is there anything you wanted to highlight before I just go on to enhanced senses?
Well, no, exactly that is to say some of those powers, like level 1 Auspex, have been kind of bumped down into just things vampires can do.
Vampires have enhanced senses. They have a natural night sight. Makes perfect sense. They can hear heartbeats, and they can smell nearby blood, like sharks. They can even learn things about people just by tasting their blood. I love that. I'm all down for giving vampires more innate powers that let them do the things that I always think about vampires just being able to do. The predatory aura is new and was a problematic element in its first edition. All vampires have the beast, that is still a thing in Requiem, and vampires can choose to flare their beast at other people, including mortals and vampires, using it to intimidate, unsettle, or otherwise throw people off their guard. Now, in second edition, it's cool, that's basically all it is. In first edition, however, it was also a tool the designers used to help explain why vampires do not have a global organization. And how does it do that? Well, whenever you encountered a vampire, any new vampire, in Requiem First Edition, predatory aura meant you had to roll to see if you frenzied. Every single time. They dropped it for the obvious reason that gets silly after a bit and is unsustainable.
I do like how they kind of combine that with the condition system. So, like, depending on how you unleash your beast, you can inflict different kinds of condition, like bestial or wanton. Similar to the feeding, where you have whether it's an assault kind of feeding or a kiss kind of feeding.
Yes, vampires can explicitly decide whether they are going for a
chomp.
quick, brutal chomp, and it will mess somebody up really badly, and you will get a lot of blood very quickly. Or you can do the kiss, which is the more classic vampiric seductive bite.
The swooning condition.
Yes. And the effects of giving blood to other people are now divided into 3 separate categories. So in Masquerade, it's just that if you feed somebody blood, then they become blood bonded to you, and if they're immortal, they gain superpowers and an indefinite lifespan. Ghouling. In Requiem, however, we have Vitae addiction, which is a risk that you just become straight up addicted to blood. The blood bond, which is a possibility of you having that supernatural attraction and desire to please the person who gave you blood. And ghouling, which is a optional thing you can do when you give somebody your blood that still does the same powers and extra benefits. It's just that you no longer have to give somebody superpowers. to make them into your servant.
Right. It's spending a willpower, right, is what makes it a ghouldom rather than
Yes.
just a blood bond. And again, these are things which were all present in Masquerade, but have been more formally kind of broken out into their own things.
A lot of things you'll see in Requiem are them taking ideas from Masquerade and trying to elaborate upon it, add more nuance and
granularity.
Yes. A couple final notes upon these elements. There are a couple alternate methods for embracing people, which are kind of oopsie methods. You can read about those on your own time. They're interesting. And finally, vampires in torpor, the long sleep, gradually become weaker and their memories fade. This has the handy out of character effect of explaining why vampires do not know everything about their own history. There is no vampire who could give you a eyewitness report of a historical figure from several thousand years ago and be accurate about it. It's also got a practical function that if your blood potency gets too high, it becomes difficult to function in vampiric society. So maybe you want to do this voluntarily to kind of thin out your blood potency and be more functional.
It's like when you have to put honey in a pot of boiling water to get it to decrystallize.
Did not know that. There is a lot in this game about every one of these topics that I've gone over. Like, I could go on about torpor, but I'm not going to.
Save it for Requiem, the podcast. Just as a couple other brief notes, some of the other terms people might be familiar with from Masquerade are also present here. Like you have Kindred as a term of art and Vitae as a term of art for the blood. Things like Regnant and Thrall for the blood bond. And there's also the same old stuff like spending a blood point or a Vitae point or whatever for appearing human with the blush of life or bumping up your attributes. Diablerie is a thing. Frenzy is a thing. Yada, yada, yada. So something that I didn't see in the mix here, but will be relevant, again, for our Dark Era read-through, is how disease can impact the mortal population from which a vampire feeds. And I would have liked to see more about to what degree, if any, vampires can be a vector of transmission, even if they remain unaffected by the disease. But I guess it's really up to the storyteller how into the weeds they want to get with aspects like that. The overall comment, emphasize what's going to be relevant for your game. So,
on the note of disease, I did use that as a significant point in a campaign I ran recently. Yeah. Vampires had unwittingly been exposed to something and had to deal with it, and it was a whole thing.
Did you ever have to sit through a bloodborne pathogens video in school?
I do not think so, and it sounds like that would not have been fun.
Oh, it was hilarious.
Oh, it was.
Anyway, just to kind of put a bow on talking about the game in and of itself, I come back to the question of how is this new and different? I don't think it particularly is. It's kind of looking at a lot of the same concepts through a different lens, and that's fine. I don't think it needs to be as different as possible just for its own sake. But one thing that does kind of fade into the background a little bit for me, it's worth saying that the stories of personal horror one can tell with vampire are deep and complex if one allows them to have their moment. So one of the old stereotypes about Masquerade is that it was vampians, the superheroes with fangs thing. I would be happy to be convinced that Requiem successfully addresses that and pushes stories more towards being about that personal horror, emphasizes the smaller scale politicking and the mortal world that the characters are so steeped in. And there are moments in the core book that do that. I think maybe the most notable to me was in the storyteller chapter, there's this climbing the ladder method of kind of asking questions about backstory and philosophy of the character. But it's in the storytelling chapter, so how likely is a new player to find that on their own? In the absence of material like that, the handling of the game's themes takes place more at the level of, I would say, the group or the organization more than the individual. And so Kindred society with all of those covenants becomes the centerpiece. As we go into more talking about crossover, I think Lost learned from that, because Lost is also a very society-focused game, but the trauma of each individual character is foregrounded throughout character creation so that it won't be far from players' minds in that context. Vampire doesn't need to center on the trauma of becoming one that its protagonists go through, but the notion of a beast I am, lest a beast I become still applies to Requiem as much as it did to Masquerade. So I would have liked to see as many words spilled on that here as changelings get for their durance, for example.
Huh.
That's my TED talk.
Honestly, I thought the Covenants gave plenty of that, because when I read the Covenant sections, that is all very clearly people finding avenues for their monstrousness. It was actually one of the things that I really struggled with in coming up with a character concept.
I'll have to go back and look. My sense with Covenants, though, is that it's there if you dig for it. It's not necessarily, in my estimation, what players would be looking for when they're choosing a covenant. Like, I think covenants are first and foremost a conceptual idea. Like, what are you doing with your night-to-night life? And then the implications of that morally and philosophically for you as a character vis-a-vis your ideas about who you are, that's kind of under the surface. I agree with you that it's there, but I think Lost does a better job of putting it front and center.
While we're on this segue.
Yeah, that's my segue.
While we're on this segue, worth noting that one of the things they did with the later books is more diversions. Vampire the Requiem, Werewolf the Forsaken, and Mage the Awakening all correspond fairly closely to their original World of Darkness counterparts. But the moment we hit Changeling and Hunter, wildly divergent.
Yeah.
And of course, there's nothing like Promethean.
Yeah. And I don't want to, I mean, none of what I just said is to imply Masquerade does a bang up job of this. Like, Masquerade's original core books did a good job, and then very quickly they veered off into the Vampians thing. It's just Requiem has been sold to me as this correction of that, and I'm not entirely convinced, but that maybe has less to do with the text itself and more to do with just how people approach it, in my experience.
Well, the text does explicitly talk, in Requiem, does explicitly talk about you playing a superhero with fangs.
Oh boy. Well,
yes, it's done in kind of like a joking fashion of like, be a villain, be a hero, maybe be both.
Yeah. Well, let's talk more about Requiem and Lost. Let's get back to our brief. So in terms of thematic overlap between Requiem and Lost, the big one for me is engagement with mortals and the idea of parasitism. So vampires maybe need humans for their blood more than changelings need humans for their emotions, but I'd say they're still the two games most heavily invested in the characters having mortal connections, maybe with the exception of Hunter or something. And you can have Lost characters be predatory in the way that vampires are, or just callous in the way that they often become.
In second edition Lost, they introduce reaping, which I do not think is part of first edition. And it is kind of like reaping from dreaming. Changeling can just go up to a mortal, tap them, and then they can fill out their glamour pool and then completely drain the mortal's willpower and give them a nasty condition that basically means that they are a broken husk of a person.
Yeah, and not every changeling has to do that, and I like the idea of there being varieties of opinion within Lost Society or Kindred Society along those lines. Like, if you have vampires fighting amongst each other, or changelings fighting amongst each other, or vampires and changelings fighting over the welfare or possession of one or more mortals, or you have vampires preying on changelings and vice versa. Actually, does Fey blood have an effect on vampires in Requiem if they drink it?
I am so glad you asked. By default, no. Vampires cannot gain sustenance from any other supernatural being. However, there is a merit called Unnatural Affinity. This merit enables a vampire to drink from one supernatural source and can be taken multiple times. So yes, a vampire could take this merit and be able to feed off of changelings, even when they can only normally feed off of other vampires. And I cannot wait to talk about how that turns into a crossover.
But they don't get like hallucinogenic, trippy stuff.
Oh, I'm sorry. They absolutely do. They have an entire section in the Player's Guide to the Contagion Chronicle that says, do whatever you want if you do anything on it. But if you want a list of things, here's a list we think is interesting for all the different supernaturals.
Beautiful. The other biggie here is politics, because obviously the Fae are caught up in the intrigues of their courts, while vampires are jockeying for influence along the lines preferred by their covenants. So while supernaturals in the world of darkness are overall invested in keeping themselves under the radar, vampires and changelings in particular make a habit of it for their own reasons. So I like the idea of them forming alliances or rivalries that play out through proxies. The fact that both of them have extended lifespans also means that their feuds and affiliations can last quite a while, though I suppose vampires tend to last a little bit longer on the whole. I like the idea of a chronicle set in a city where the emotional direction of the population and the way that evolves over decades turns out to be a power struggle between like an elder vampire and a high weird fae. And then you have the party of neonates and or fresh escapees from Arcadia joining forces to stop this cycle.
I had a list of crossover like concepts. Should I just say these as they come up or wait to the end?
This is your list of story hooks.
Yes. So
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. An elderly and powerful wizened is nearing the end of their much extended lifespan, but they aren't willing to end things. They are embedded too deeply in Fae politics and, by the grace of age, have been a player among the vampires as well. Now they seek to extend their life by any means necessary. Ghouling, lichdom, look forward to that in the future Changeling episode, a twisted embrace, or perhaps even becoming one of the true Fae. All paths are trouble for everyone, so it's up to their juniors, or perhaps a coterie from the other side, to figure out how to navigate this power player's final days, and either make sure that they are final, or bring them in on terms that are favorable.
Could work.
Regarding the idea of them feeding off the same person, got one for you. A Daeva and a beast spring courtier have gotten into a competition over who is the most desirous. Now they are painting the town red, literally and otherwise, leaving ensorcelled and drained, physically and emotionally, mortals in their wake. Investigators must step carefully as they are walking in the footsteps of a couple of truly depraved monsters.
Uh-huh. And I like these when they kind of directly hit those central themes. The other question to point to here is how much are these two splats likely to know about each other, which is separate from the equally valid question of how likely are they to encounter each other. And putting aside that the answer to both is however much is needed for your game, and without getting into the whatever it was, the lore merit that we had in Glimpses of the Unknown or whatever, I do think they are fairly likely to run into each other. They both move among humans and trade in passions. They both act with subtlety. I think you had a story hook about Oniromancers. There's a lot of ink on the dreams vampires have in torpor and what may come of those.
Yes, vampires do have some interesting interactions with dreams. First, a broad context, changelings might be fascinated by the powers of majesty and nightmare to inflict overwhelming desire and fear. Vampires, going to your question of how they can interact, can use auspex, uncanny perception, to clock a changeling for what it is, and changelings conversely have kenning to let them pick up that something is supernatural in the area, possibly that dude with the pale skin. Specific to their interests, however, vampires have a couple of devotions called Sun's Brutal Dreamscape and Wet Dream.
Ugh.
The former causes you to suffer burns as though you went into sunlight if the vampire decides that they want to do that themselves. Absolutely wild. And Wet Dream is...
I can't.
Sorry, this pause is not meant to be because it's lewd. It's because I'm saying it and I'm just like blinking on what it actually does. This is very funny.
Let's leave it to the listener's imagination. And,
I just
Spring
remember
Court favorite.
that it's not an... Anyway.
It's not what you think it is. Moving on.
It's not what you think it is. Moving on. Sorry, I just checked and it is kind of what you think it is.
Oh, no.
Moving on, though. Another point. Some Maquette can take a merit to have dream visions, which makes them a potent source for changelings to play ride along, because changelings are all about those prophetic dreams, and now they can just go to a source for it. They might not have a choice, because I looked it up, and the recommended effect for a vampire drinking changeling blood is the vampire has strange dreams when she next sleeps. If she wants to, she can invite the changeling into her bastion, her personal dreamscape. allowing them to unerringly find it.
That's it?
That's a whole thing in itself. But as for how this can work into a crossover, here's one for you. Neuromancers have discovered a growing web of mortals afflicted with what appears to be a form of dream poison. Dreams of being burned by fire, or their worst fears coming to life, or being fed on by half-remembered monsters. It is up to the Changeling PCs to identify the predator is a vampire and track them down before they release something truly awful into the minds of dreamers, or worse, catch the jealous attention of the gentry.
See, I'm fine with that, but honestly, I don't think I would make a connection between the games using the hedge, even though you could easily have a vampire wander into a goblin market or something, because it would feel too forced to me. Like, I want to leave that space to the changelings and bring the groups together on Earth, because that's where the modus operandi of each kind of unites and runs into each other. But that's me.
A few other thematic overlaps that vampires possess. Vampires do have some abilities to bind people to their will beyond the blood bond. I've already mentioned how Carthian laws can alter reality to their whims. Invictus oaths have some interesting effects upon your relationship with other vampires. Either one of them might inspire a changeling who's interested in making a compact with law or fealty as the basis for a court, and the effects of these merit paths as inspiration for mantles. The Wish is a vampiric power that lets them bargain with mortals for total devotion after giving them some really super cool benefits. Changelings, I think, would resent the idea of the blood bond because they despise enslavement and mental influence. And my final note before finishing my crossover ideas is changelings might be interested in the coils of the dragon. That's the Ordo Dracul Enlightenment things, as a way of learning how to overcome their own frailties. Perhaps even the quest for a way to overcome cold iron itself. I do have a few more crossover ideas, but did you have anything else general about the thematic overlap before I just burn through these?
Without knowing many specifics of the disciplines, I do think the legalistic mysticism of oaths and mantles seems interesting. And the bloodbound angle, I think, is a really powerful one to base a story on. Coils, yeah, I guess, although my feeling is always that games are kind of undercut when they go, here's your default weakness, but also here's how you can get around that weakness. Like, yeah, it just takes something out of it for me. With Majesty and Nightmare, I kind of feel like the Fae would look at those disciplines and find them inefficient. Like, I could see the reverse being likely too, where the Daeva and Nosferatu are begging the Spring and Autumn courts to like learn how they work their mojo. But yeah, there's options.
Speaking of options for helping each other out, a Maquette Ordo Dracul member and a Darkling Autumn courtier are each tasked with investigating the other's splat. Explore how they either work together, corrupt or cheat each other, or both, because why not? It's vampires and fairies. Of course they would do both to each other. 2 out of 5. An Invictus Ventru Prince is pursuing a truce with the Changeling courts, perhaps over one of the previously mentioned matters. However, the courts are forever in conflict, and the crown is handed off every season to a monarch who might have different opinions. Can either side help the freehold resolve its differences so they can get along, or alternatively, outright reject this alliance? 3. One of the gangrel has discovered a path into the hedge and begun feeding on changelings. Rooting them out will be difficult enough, but the sheer power their eating habits afford them means that they are among the most potent kindred that there exist. 4. The changeling courts approach the Carthians and the Invictus separately with an offer. Teach us the ways of your deal-making, and we will teach you something of ours. Both covenants have discovered that the other is considering the offer. Now, each is racing to figure out whether a deal with the Fae is as good or bad as it seems. And the question as always is, what are the real motivations of the Fae? And finally, a changeling, or perhaps one of their mortal touchstones, has become bloodbound to a vampire. They are in too deep to pull free, so it's up to a motley to work together in identifying the vampire and driving them out, saving their friend.
I think the last two are my favorites out of those. With the gangrel one, I kind of feel, wouldn't the gangrel have an easier time drinking their blood on Earth? But yeah.
Honestly, I started writing about that, and then I started thinking about gangrels turning a piece of the hedge into their own domain and feeding off hobgoblins.
Mhm.
And I was going to get very in deep, so what you got is me cutting
Oh,
myself
okay.
off
All right.
from an entire thing.
So everything we've been talking about so far, I would say, is pretty much localized to the core book, and a lot of it is also speculative. What would happen if we put these two groups together, kind of stuff. But you have also pointed to the first edition Requiem supplement, Danse Macabre, as having a direct piece of crossover with the Children of the Thorns Minor Covenant. So who are they, and why should changelings care?
The Children of the Thorns are one of numerous new covenants added in Danse Macabre. It's a book full of new systems that you can use for your game. The Children of the Thorns themselves are a group of close-knit vampiric cultists who serve a mysterious entity called Mary, who is definitely one of the true Fae, although they do not know that. In fact, they know very little, if at all, anything about her. Initiates learn of the cult by being granted a pilgrimage by an existing member. They do a variation of the Bloody Mary ritual, step through a mirror, and wind up in a forever dark cemetery that is definitely 100% in the hedge. At the center of the cemetery is the titular crypt, which leads to the enigmatic Mary. All children visit her on their first trip down, and what a trip it is. They come back with one less dot of willpower, one less dot of humanity, and missing at least 1 point of vitae, presumably spent on something unspeakable happening down there.
She lives.
She lives. Once this is done, however, they are a full member, and the perks are not bad. They get bonuses on socializing with other children members. Okay, cool. They get a bonus to avoid frenzying on them, which is very nice considering this game, but a penalty to avoid frenzying on any other vampire, which is what's going to be a more common concern. All of which drives them to spend a lot more time around each other. And at the crypt is a single location that the children can reach from any part of the world. And they can even use it as a form of teleportation. One vampire hopping into the crypt, and then another using the temporary opening they create to step back into that vampire's place. As a result, they are able to operate on a much bigger scale, much faster than anyone else, and they use this to their advantage. They are elitists who believe that their status as Mary's quote-unquote chosen makes them special. What that means is unknown because, again, Mary does not really talk to them. They just kind of think that she does.
Weird.
Anybody can join, but there is a preponderance of Circle of the Crone members because it offers a more focused divinity figure and a quicker ascent to power and influence than trying to deal with the broader Circle of the Crone cults. Titles and duties include Cemetery Attendant. These are the only children allowed to quote-unquote hang out at the cemetery. Usually have been around for a couple of decades and made some secret sacrifice. They enforce the Elysium of this place and guard it against intruders. Oh, I must note that because it is forever dark, vampires who come here do not need to worry about sunlight, nor do they need to fall asleep.
Hooray!
Right? Oracles, the leaders of the Covenant, acting as princes in cities, and diviners of the visions that Mary supposedly grants them. Some of them are frauds or have been driven insane.
Why not both?
They can be both. This is a great time to note that the most common punishment for somebody acting out against the other children is throw them into the crypt and let Mary decide what happens to them. When the oracles have a vision, they gather the other children around for a hearing about it, which doubles as a chance for everybody to socialize. And finally, sacred explorers attempt to map a safe path from the crypt to the physical world. They are literally traveling through the hedge. Most commonly, it comes out in Cape Town, South Africa. They also attempt to map the crypt, which sounds like a bad idea to me, but you do use sacred explorers.
Why Cape Town? Out of curiosity, is that like a...
I've been trying to figure it out myself. They talk about other places they can wind up at, like it says they can wind up in the deserts of Arizona, but I don't know, maybe there's some association with the Bloody Mary myth and the location? I'm honestly not sure. So that's it for everything that's from Dance Macabre. However, for those of you who are craving more information on the group, we have a upcoming fan-made supplement for the Circle of the Chrome that will feature an entry about the Children of the Thorn, updating them for 2nd edition.
Right on.
nWoD Dark Publishing was kind enough to furnish us with a copy that previews what the material will be. Notable new additions or changes include opening with a chilling story of a girl completing the Bloody Mary ritual and winding up outside of the crypt. The vampire that finds her has thoughts.
Mm-hmm. None of these, like, aside from the 5 core covenants and some passing mentions, did any of the kind of other covenants developed in 1st edition get updated into 2nd? Or is that like, that's the homebrew gap that they're working into here?
I believe that is the gap they're working into. I know there's been at least one bloodline I think they've revised into a covenant, but yeah, I believe they're doing some work with that overall.
Yeah, I know they did the Carthians book, and I think maybe one of the other ones I read, but yeah.
There is a summary for the children, the why would you want to join? This is quoting the book. You're sick of running from the sun. You want to make a space for kindred to call their own. You don't want being dead to stop you from seeing the world. You want to worship a god you know is real. You want to be on the ins for once. You enjoy being a gatekeeper. You want to feel special. There's lots of other changes, but readers, you will need to discover that on your own if you so choose.
Link will be provided when it's released, for sure. With the Children of the Thorns, they're fine. I think this is... I mean, I already said I'm not interested in shoving vampires into the hedge, so that part I'm indifferent to. But to kind of return to your point earlier about the toolbox method, I think that what this is kind of summoning up in me is, obviously I like people putting in the time and effort to develop hooks like this and find all these different angles that they can take with it. But at the same time, I worry that getting lost in those details kind of pulls away from what the core of the game should be about to me. And I think crossover is always tricky because that's, the things like the powers and the metaphysical alignments and whatever else, that's where people focus on first. So what I would trying to turn this into a thought, what I would push back with is to say, rather than focus on what is the interaction between this merit and this contract and this discipline and this aspect of the vampiric condition and this aspect of the fey condition, focusing more on those themes. So what you just read about wanting to feel special, worshiping a god you know is real, all of that is very narrative driven. And that to me is easier to align with something like the role that a keeper represents within certain parts of fey society. And maybe No More Dark's book will lean into that hard. That would be pretty cool. But for any game that kind of uses the children as a hook, that's what I would want to focus on to make it work for me.
Yeah, speaking as someone who's wrapping up a campaign going for 3 years with a ton of crossover, just
wrapping up.
I know.
It ended.
We're about 200 experience points into this game.
Yeah, all right, that's fair.
Yeah, and it's gotten to a point where everyone is near the end or has finished up their characters' personal arcs, and it's a lot easier to start a new game to come up with new arcs rather than inventing a reason why the recent elected regent to the Autumn Court is going through another major change in their life.
Okay.
It's been quite the ride and a lot of fun, but all things must come to an end eventually.
Yeah.
That said, the point I was trying to get to is that for these games, I recommend, if you're starting with Changeling or even Vampire, think about what your player characters represent, the themes that they take an interest in, and then focus on that. So if you have one player playing a winter courtier who's all about getting people free from the chains of enslavement by the true fae and helping them hide, maybe toss in a vampire who's all about hunting people down and trying to enslave them. Show how those things conflict. If you have the changeling who is a socialite, who is very free with how they feed off of mortals, perhaps dangerously so, introduce a vampire who wants to do likewise and make the changeling think, do I want to be like this person?
That's sensible. And I've said before, I'm not much for crossover games, but when crossovers happen, I think there are reasonable thematic connections between Lost and Requiem. The same is true for Changeling the Dreaming and Vampire the Masquerade, albeit with a different tone. And we haven't really in this episode gotten into the question of like raw power level in the sense of who would win in a fight or whatever, because that's good. I don't want to talk about that because it's probably the least interesting angle to me. But the connections that we're talking about strike me as ones that have very little to do with how many dice you're rolling. And the game allows for you to do that, but the ideal for me is to not focus on that. Going through this core book made me appreciate more the delicacy of stories you can tell with either game. I would encourage storytellers and players to, think about those narratives. And I got the sense from skimming Requiem for Regina, the Dark Era we'll be covering, that it's a little bit more steeped in blood, but it's still centered on these kinds of intrigues. So, excellent. And that's I think that's all I have to say about Lost Requiem crossover. Anything else to throw in at the last second?
Just that I would feel bad if we did not mention there is an entire Changeling entitlement focused upon dealing with other supernatural beings. So I don't remember what you thought about them, though, Puka.
Remind me which one that is.
Oh, boy. I'm sorry, I have to actually pull open the book if you want that.
Isn't it the one where we were like, isn't that just the Autumn Court?
Something like that, yeah. They're the ones who have, like, if you look carefully, they have, like, something from every single splat that had been released up to that point. But yeah.
the ones that are, like, covered with the writing and everything.
I think so, yeah. A point is that they are the obvious ones to go to if you want a character that is focused upon dealing with other supernatural beings, vampires or otherwise. However, storytellers, please do not make players have to play that entitlement if they want to do that. It is perfectly okay for a crossover to happen because a vampire and a changeling meet in a bar.
Yeah, well, and you get the thrill of discovery and uncovering if you don't know anything about the other. I think that's compelling, but equally compelling might be to reach out to us on any of the various channels through which you can reach out to us, which include Discord at discord.me/CTP, sending us an email at podcast@changelingthepodcast.com. We're on Facebook and YouTube under Changeling the Podcast, on Mastodon at changelingpod@dice.camp, and on Patreon at patreon.com/changelingthepodcast. Links to all of these will be in the show notes to this episode. So until next time, I have been the blood-soaked Puka.
And I am the Gould Fetch.
Don't really have much of an outro. Courtier, I hardly know her.
What the heck?
Dig deeply enough into Kindred society, and you'll find the bloodsuckers have a discipline for almost everything, some of which are of passing interest to one group of fae or another. The Pulcinell bloodline uses the arcane powers of Commedia to secrete vitae on their faces to take on various disguises which grant archetypal abilities, super useful for gussying up a changeling mask. Members of the Spring Court could learn a thing or two from the Parasitic bloodline, whose discipline of frisson manipulates physiological pleasure response, sometimes amplifying them to the point that their victims get goosebumps inside their very circulatory systems. And while Requiem vampires might not as a rule believe they descend from Cain, the covenant known as the Marked honors that psychopathic greengrocer with the magic called allotment, capable of reducing the hedge's psychoactive shrubbery into discount celery and leafy greens rich with vitamin K. We believe in fostering learning exchanges with these and other niche groups in the vampiric sphere, with the primary beneficiaries being our patrons, namely Bad Company, Ben the Canadian, Siglosson Jr., Derek, Dorcadus, Alaris, Henry Kraft, Ia Bull, Oreo, Raz Caboose, Rebecca P., Sanchiger, Sija, the Crew of Erebus, and Ware Buffalo. Many thanks to them. And if you too would like to get a shout-out each episode and or more information about off-color supernatural powers, you can sign up at www.patreon.com/changelingthepodcast. As always, we also appreciate reviews on the podcast listening platform of your greatest convenience, or just tell your favorite ghoul or vitae addict about our show. Do keep your wits about you should you meet any pale and pointy-toothed fashionistas in the dimly lit nightclubs of the dank streets.
but also let the weird and wonderful be your protection as you keep on dreaming.
Here come the outtakes.
I'll cut this later probably, but just out of nowhere, I have to tell you that I had a dream last night that there was an earthquake in Flagstaff.
Oh.
And I was like, oh no, I better tell Fetch and check and make sure she doesn't like know anybody who was impacted. And so then like we were talking about it in my dream, and then I checked, I was like, oh, it's Flagstaff, Utah, which I don't think actually exists. And you're like, fuck Flagstaff, Utah. Anyway, just FYI.
Incredible.